Thank you very much. It's indeed a great pleasure to be back here to speak to you about public policy making and the role of civil society, particularly at the time when civil society appears to be very active, with all the newspapers and TV reports talking about civil society and somebody saying, if they are civil, are we uncivil? So it's a whole discussion that is going on, whether what is a civil society, and if there is a civil society, is there an uncivil society? And particularly at this time, whether civil society has any role in terms of determining public policy. So it's a kind of a situation that is developing in the country where we have, by and large, accepted that citizen groups or civil society organizations have some role. What is the extent of that role is something that we are going to discuss, but role in terms of determining public policy. And what I will try to do in the next few minutes or hour that I have, to put forward at least my session into three parts. One is the traditional way of looking at public policy making. And the traditional way of public policy making with the kinds of institutions that we have in this country and which have been involved in policy determination and decision making for policy. The second part, I would like to discuss what has been the change that has occurred, particularly the change that has occurred after neoliberal economic reforms were undertaken. And change, it was not merely a change in economic policies, but there has been a change in the whole understanding of how policies are determined, and particularly leading to what I call a transformation from government to governance. The third part, I would like to look at the public policy processes in this changed context, in this changed situation, and how does civil society organizations come in to play a role within this changed context. So, and then finally, of course, we'll discuss what are the challenges, what are the questions that are raised, whether we accept all the kind of roles that civil society plays, and that's for the discussion that we'll have. Let me begin by saying that traditionally, policy making was confined to government institutions. That we expected it is the role of the government to make policy. It was the role of the government to determine policy. And once this acceptance was there, then we went on to develop institutions that would provide for this policy determination. And this was not only in India, but I think all over the world, this was an accepted understanding. And even today, it is this understanding that it's only the role of the government to make policy that we are talking of policy paralysis that keeps on coming up in the media and all of that. Why? Because we are expecting that here is a government that should make policies, and it is not doing so. So there's a legitimate expectation in the traditional sense that policy determination takes place within the government. What were the institutional frames that were created in order to do this, in order to perform this function? In India, particularly after the Plan strategy was adopted. One major institutional innovation was that of establishment of Planning Commission. The role of the Planning Commission, I think, is something extremely important to understand in providing for what came to be known as technocratic view of policy or technocratic mode of policy making. That we in the government, we in the Planning Commission knew what the problems of the country were, that there was poverty or there was industrial development need to be done, or urban development had to be done. And then, because we knew that there were problems out there, we would go ahead and make plans for development. And in this understanding, what was most important was creation of what has come to be known as a kind of a rational model. A rational model in which we get all the information that is needed, that is required, and within that given data and within the information that we have, we create plans. So rationality in terms of availability of information, availability of data, using that data and information for purposes of preparing plans and therefore determining policies was what the institutional framework was asked to do. And this was the role of the Planning Commission. Now, if this was the role, then the Planning Commission, the ministries, and the government, they were all involved in terms of providing the technical inputs into policies. So Planning Commission provided for kind of what has come to be known as a kind of a technocratic plan. And we went on from one plan to the other. And what did the government or the Planning Commission depend upon? The government and the Planning Commission depended upon experts. You called in experts, you called in technocrats, people who knew the job, who knew what are the specific ways to resolve issues. You got these experts and they provided for these models or these plans and things like that. So if I might say so, there was a very large machinery built up of expertise, of technical people, and these experts and these technical people then put their heads together for preparing these plans. Reliance was on experts. And to a very great extent, if you look at the earlier documents, and documents even at the time of the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a great believer in this technocratic approach to a very great extent, relying on ISI, relying on Malnabis, etc., etc., more or less allowed the Planning Commission's proposals to come through the cabinet and to be passed. So what I'm trying to stress is that traditionally, for all these years, we have looked at or had faith in technocrats and experts in terms of preparation of plans and policies for development in the country. And for implementing that kind of a faith, we created such types of institutions which would then create a forum where these experts and technocrats can act and determine policies. As I said earlier, this is not a phenomenon that was restricted only to India. By and large, in 1960s and 1970s, this was the general kind of picture that was available. change, there was some change occurring, and that change that occurred was in the time of President Johnson. And President Johnson, he announced for development of primarily the development of the urban areas because of poverty and riots in the urban areas, he announced what is known as creation of Great Society. And in that creation of Great Society through funding, through policies, etc., where large number of institutions which were not in the government also started participating and trying to evaluate programs, monitor programs. They were giving funds for preparing projects which may be local. This was probably the beginning of involvement of society actors in trying to frame policies within this concept of great society. And of course, this later on has continued to expand. America has been on a very different footing as far as relationship between state and society is concerned, but probably this was one of the beginnings. But the major change that occurred in this conceptualization came with what has come to be known as the concept of governance. Governance is used in all kinds of terms. All people use whenever there are failures. Instead of saying administrative failures, we talk of governance failures. I think it's very important to understand this difference between what we used to talk about as administrative failures to now talking about governance failures. Because governance became something very different from what was conceptualized as public administration. It was no more merely an implementation agency. It was no more an instrument of implementing public policies, but it was much more than that. Again, governance as a concept and a thrust has come from a kind of an Anglo-American model. It has come through promotional work done by international agencies. This first concept was used in the late 80s and early 90s, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into that. But one thrust or a major point that was put forward on the basis of developments that had taken place in various other areas was that governance means regulation or steering society through a cooperation of several actors. And these several actors means not only the state, but market as well as civil society. I think the major thrust of the concept of governance was opening up state activity, what was supposed to be the monopoly of state to other actors. And so the concept of governance is a complex, it has a certain amount of complexity in the sense that you are not limiting yourself to one single institution. You are not limiting yourself to only state. But you are expanding this concept of governance to other actors in society. And also, in this expansion, saying that policies and their implementation take place within the cooperative field of these three actors. And with this, when you talk of this cooperative field, the term that is usually used is that there is a network. The network of these three actors, which through their interaction craft public policy. So public policy making is now not the monopoly of state alone. Public policy making is something which is an output of these networks. And you can have broad networks and you can have limited networks, networks in a specific area, but the monopoly of state in determining policy has been diluted. It's no more the monopoly of state. The second more important aspect of governance has been that this kind of a distinction that was being made between public and private has also got blurred. There's no sharp division because the market is now involved in state activity as much as state. And therefore, if the state and market come together to frame industrial policy, then you are not really distinguishing between the public and the private sector. So the boundaries of public and the private sector, to a very great extent, have got blurred. But this is not merely in the economic field. Look at the social and cultural field, where these boundaries have got blurred. What was supposed to be completely private, where the state was not supposed to intervene, is now merging into public. And there are various issues that are being raised, being said that this is not a private issue, it is a public issue. Look at what the Khap Panchayats or the role of Khap Panchayats doing in terms of boys and girls getting married. What was supposed to be a private matter is now no more a private matter. It's a public matter. You're pushing it into the public matter and saying governance is involved. You've got to make a policy. You make a policy that allows for boys and girls to live together or get married which are not within the caste. Look at so many other things. Dress of women, raids on pubs, which are supposed to be, in most cases, private matters, are now blurring into public matters where social intervention is required. So what is happening is that in this broad conceptualization, government does not become the only actor. In this broad conceptualization, society, social intervention, social regulations become as much important actors as the state itself. So if there is a coercive action to be required, then society and social organizations demand the state that you need to do this. There is a demand from the state that Khap Panchayats cannot do this.